if you've got a system you're working with, you can't fix it linearly. You can't always just replace parts. And there's the difference, right? So many of us think, well, I'm just going to be the replace parts, when the fact remains that you have to, if you're going to have a systemic company, you have to have systems response, which is deal with the stuff that's going on as an organization, not just typecasting and finger pointing and replacing people.
Welcome to the Fail It Forward podcast, lessons for life, leadership, and turning failure into success. I'm John Lowry, your host. Today, we think about organizational failure. Many of our podcast episodes have focused on individual failure, but the reality is that organizations succeed and fail as well. And there's a lot of expertise, a lot of things that we can learn about the warning signs of organizational failure, about what to do about the different kinds of ways that an organization can fail. Not just looking at the key performance indicators, but going a bit deeper and thinking about the processes that they have in place or the people that are coming together into the workplace to accomplish the mission of the organization. And today we have an incredible expert here with us, Dr. Steve Joiner. Dr. Joiner is the Dean of the College of Leadership and Public Service at Lipscomb University. He also serves as the Executive Director of the Institute for Conflict Management. Dr. Joiner is a conflict systems expert. He works with leaders across the country in terms of thinking about how to use systems theory and how to bring very practical approaches to helping organizations not only prevent, but also prepare for moments of conflict that are just inevitable. So let's jump into our conversation with Dr. Steve Joiner. Steve, welcome to the Fail It Forward podcast.
Oh, man, it's great. Glad to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Steve and I have had the opportunity to spend a lot of time working together in the academic setting, but also thinking together in the areas of conflict management and negotiation. And Steve has done a lot of incredible work in terms of helping organizations think about how to work through conflict in a way that is constructive, but also in a way that is effective in terms of dealing with issues, but doing it in a way where the organization can continue its mission and continue to pull its community together to be able to carry forward on those missions. And so I'm excited today, Steve, to talk about something we haven't really talked about on the podcast before, and that is thinking about organizational failure.
Yeah.
And to help leaders be able to diagnose quickly a potential moment of failure coming, and then help them think about how is it that they can deal with that failure. So to kick things off, let's talk about just the different ways that you see organizations fail. I mean, everyone knows the performance failure, right? There's no longer any money, and as a result of that, the organization goes bankrupt. I mean, everyone's aware of that, but that's not the only way an organization fails.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So you and I are both aware of the triangle of durability in our field in conflict management, and I use that analogy a lot. There's three ways that organizations do well, and there's three ways they can kind of fail. One is through people, one is through performance, and one is through process. And you've seen that before. Well, if we one way I see organizations fail is we kind of lay that triangle on them. When organizations call me, or they call you, or companies call, they're generally kind of baffled by the fact that things are going south on them. And when you start to diagnose it, you realize most organizations are pretty good with the people performance side. They know how to hire. They know how to put performance standards together. What they don't normally have or have good processes in place for when things go south. And I see that a lot. So I hire really good people. I put a lot of performance expectation on them, but I really haven't thought about what happens when something goes wrong within my organization. My team falls apart. What are, beyond just basic HR rules, which are, you and I both know, kind of the extreme of when it goes completely south, but what about that in-between stage when things aren't performing like they should, people aren't getting along like they should, teams aren't doing well? What do I have in place to help them solve that problem? And so it's fascinating. I think a lot of leaders think in terms of people and performance, but I think where they get in trouble is not having the tools to manage stuff when the road gets bumpy. So they avoid it. So they just don't talk about it, or they overreact and fire somebody, right? And so I think one way you see them get in trouble is not having good processes in place to manage conflict when it comes along.
And that's really been a big part of your academic research and
Right.
expertise that you've built. Talk a little bit about just your experience and your background in this space that causes people to call you to say, come help us with these processes that are going wrong.
Well, really, I'll go way back. I probably don't need to, but I was in ministry full time at one point, and
Hmm.
people say, "Well, how did you go from being a minister to doing this kind of work?"
Sure.
Well, I went into conflict management because the worst behaved people I knew went to church, and churches were terrible at managing difficulty. And so, and we all wanted to individually solve it. Well, you talk to that person or but it seemed to me there was a systemic issue in how we were structured and how we did business, right? So I got into that field. How structurally do we need to be different systemically? And then I was talking about that one day at some church conference, and the CEO of a major supermarket chain came up to me. I'll tell you, it's United Supermarkets in Texas. We're kind of like Publix. You know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
And Dan comes up to me and says, "Hey, man, we've got the same problem. You need to come talk to our people." And I said, "Oh, no, I tend to work with churches." He said, No, same problem. And so then I began to realize it wasn't just religious organizations. It wasn't just volunteer organizations, but even very high-performing companies like United still didn't have good processes or structures to manage conflict. And what they were doing, they were avoiding it. They were just ignoring it till it got out of control. And so that's kind of what brought me to this. And then I just got fascinated and realized it kind of cuts across even sectors. So, government, private industry, they still lack these a couple things: good systems to manage, and then the foresight to see what's coming. And so many of them, there's a great, and I may be talking too much here, John, but there's this great cycle called Dale's Life Cycle of Business. And he said companies are most ready to make major changes at two places: when they're peaked out and they're being really high performing, or they're flat or the back in the gutter. He said when they're ascending, they don't think about the future. And when they're going downhill, it's hard to think about the future because you're just trying to paste it together. And he said, so the time to think about how do we manage what's on the horizon that's going to be a problem is about the time you're performing really well and you don't want to think about it. So you got those two things. No good processes aren't good, and the time to think about the future is now, and we don't want to do that. We're too results oriented.
Yeah. So with any organization, business, nonprofit, you name it, any organization that is made up of people, there's going to be conflict, and that's just inevitable.
Inevitable.
But practically, share with leaders who are listening to this, when does a conflict reach a point to where, in order to keep it from becoming a failure or becoming something that is more substantial, what are the warning signs that you're looking for and saying, okay, I got to do something about this?
Yeah, there's a couple there's a lot of them, but there's a couple that pop up a lot, John. One is what I call when someone calls me and says, "Man, we've got a lot of unrelated conflict. We got this group unhappy, and it just seems like difficulties popping up in all these different places." And they'll say it's all unrelated, and I will tell them, no, it's not. I mean, systems are all related with one another. And so when you see basically surprising kind of unhappiness popping up and there's not a linear explanation for it, oh, well, I get it why accounting's unhappy in tax season. I get it why, manufacturing seems overwhelmed this time of year, but there's just unhappiness. When you see those different kind of things popping up and you feel like you're playing whack-a-mole chasing it, that's a sign of systemic failure. And you need to go below the line, figure out what's really going on here, because those things aren't unrelated. That is one that I think is a sign. Two is when the organization becomes focused on the here and now too much. And so when it seems like you're just solving one problem after another and you can't seem to pull yourself out enough to do the visionary stuff, I've heard people say this before, it's hard to see the horizon when you're down in the belly of the ship working on the motor all the time. If it feels like you spend all your time down there keeping the engines running, you've got a systemic failure that you're sticking your fingers in the dike. A guy named Speed Lees has an escalation model of conflict, and he says first couple of 3 levels are normal and can be solved. We call them issue, conflict, and anyway, the 3 levels. I think conflict's the third one. He said once you cross a line and it moves into these fight or flight modes or consistently unhappy, you're going to have to bring in a third party, outside expertise, because you have a systemic issue. So those kind of three things I think are markers for in organizations.
That's great. And you've talked about systems a couple of times. Share a little more in terms of conflict systems. Are these systems that prevent conflict, or are they systems that help deal with conflict?
Well, so it's interesting. I use the word systems in a broad view. In other words, every company is a system. And the way I describe it is a company is not like a jar of marbles. You just didn't get a bunch of individuals and pour them into a jar, and now all these individuals work together. It's more like mixing paint. And so when you put people into a organization, it's like, you take red and yellow, and you get purple out of this thing. That's a systemic view. In other words, you can't just always say, I'm going to predict what's going to happen, because when you mix people, you get a different result than you expect, right? And so if you've got a system you're working with, you can't fix it linearly. You can't always just replace parts. And there's the difference, right? So many of us think, well, I'm just going to be the replace parts, when the fact remains that you have to, if you're going to have a systemic company, you have to have systems response, which is deal with the stuff that's going on as an organization, not just typecasting and finger pointing and replacing people. And so when I talk about systems, I'm referring to managing conflict as a whole within an organization, rather than trying to always just take it down to one or two people. If you get rid of them, or we'll make these two changes, it's going to fix everything.
So the organizations that are very intentional, very proactive in terms of developing the systems, what are give me some examples. What are the kinds of things that they're doing to develop that kind of conflict competent culture?
So first of all, they're very proactive.
Okay.
So they don't wait till there's a problem to try to resolve it. So they're on the front end doing consistent training of leaders. They're a company who's really good at this, interestingly enough, is Farm Credit Mid-America.
Okay.
So I'd never heard of them till I got involved with some of their work. So they're basically a bank that lends to farmers. And
Sure.
you're sitting there thinking, how complicated is this? But they were voted one of the 10 best run companies in America. And when I started delving into it, what it comes down to, they're big. They're all over the middle U.S., is they have very, very detailed training of their leaders. And it's not just how to be a bank. It's how to lead. It's about philosophy of company. It's about our vision. And they constantly are training what many people call mid-level managers. The leaders get it. The mid-level managers are getting a constant stream of information, of training, to know how to keep because if you got the vision right, the other stuff tends to fall in place. And the second thing they do is they pull the mid-managers together a lot so they can cross-talk. Is that making sense?
Sure.
And then third, one thing that I helped them put in place, and I'll be honest, I stole it from Dr. Jerry Hickson at Vanderbilt. Jerry told me, as long as I acknowledge him, I can do this. But they have something they do at Vanderbilt for doctors who kind of get off track. They have something called the cup of coffee theory.
Sure.
And so they have a highly trained peer who then takes them out for a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And they have kind of a non-threatening, I'm talking about a non-threatening kind of reset toward vision. And so Mid-America did something I think every company ought to think about, which is consistent training from the day you walk in the door as a leader, constant communication between managers of your peer group, and then when things start to go slightly awry, and there's a lot of theory behind that, why this really, really works, they have a trained peer who's gone to more training on how to have difficult conversations, which you do all the time with people, who kind of helps them reset. And those three preventative things have kept their culture in line.
So some tools that you can put in place up front that then you can go to and use in the moment of conflict. Thinking about those tools, a lot of wisdom in terms of getting those developed. For a leader that finds themselves in a place where it's too much for the tools, or the conflict is too acute, or maybe they haven't done the intentional work on the front end, and so they don't have the tools. What do you tell people? I know probably the answer is it depends on the circumstance.
Exactly.
But What do you do with a leader that literally finds themselves overwhelmed with conflict? What's the starting place for trying to get it under control?
Yeah. So, of course, in our field, the best answer to everything's it
Of
depends, right?
course. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's interesting because that's the phone call that you and I get,
Uh-huh.
right? So some CEO will call me or someone call me in a company and they'll say, "Hey, are you the guy that works with organizations that gets sideways?"
Yeah.
And I always say it depends. What's going on, and then they will usually pretty good about identifying it. So they're not usually. It's not like they don't know, and they'll identify it, and then they'll say, "Well, we've tried everything." And that doesn't bother me a lot, John, because what they've done is they tried the same old thing over and over
Over and over
again.
again.
It's that iceberg theory of
Yeah,
conflict.
yeah.
They've done the above the waterline thing. We've had meetings. We've had all hands meetings. We've done all these things. It doesn't get any better.
Yeah.
But what you and I are talking about is going below the line with that. And I think what needs to happen is systemically, if you got a leader who's in over their head, let's assume they have good intention. If you got a leader with bad intention, that's a different animal. Assume this person's a good person, want to do a good job, and they drive it in the ditch. Understand that they probably can't get out themselves. So the instruction of go work it out or go sort it out or bring me an answer is really not that productive for them because they really don't know how to get out of the ditch and they need a hand out. Then you've got to decide, do I have a person within the organization who can coach them out of that ditch, or do I need to go a third party who can come in and get them out of that moment? But the idea of telling them, go figure it out, or handing them some kind of instruction manual and letting them work on it, most of those times, by the time they call us, that's well beyond that. And so I would think within organizations, you pre-prepared other people to help coach them out, or you go outside to bring in an expert to help them work through their conflict.
Let's talk about the relationship between change and conflict for just a second. And as organizations, every organization at some level has had to change as a result of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Whether
higher ed is good. We work in higher ed.
Oh, goodness.
It's train wreck.
Yeah. And, as a result of that, there's going to be organizations that realize that the change is not just temporary, but they will have to make permanent change to be able to survive or to thrive after the pandemic.
Right.
And one of the things that I think causes people to be a little weary and a little resistant to change is that it is something that produces conflict.
Oh, yeah.
And so as you're talking to leaders who are having to navigate change and lead people through change, knowing that whatever change comes will create conflict because it's change. What are you saying to those leaders today that recognize that the conflict may not be here yet, but the change is, and so the conflict's right behind it? Yeah.
Yeah. So we go back to there's systems theory is actually a theory of organizations. It goes back to a guy named Murray Bowen, but Bowen gave kind of 5 things that are key to remember in dealing with organizational systems, and one of those is all living, breathing systems tend to be homeostatic. In other words, everybody hates change.
Yeah.
Don't care if they tell you they love change, they hate change.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you poke a system, whether it's you, whether it's society, there's going to be ripples within that system. And the tendency of that system is to resist it, to fight back, right? And so I think the first thing I want to tell people, because I see frustrated leaders like, I pick higher ed because that's our field. You know what? Higher ed's changed. One of our good friends always says, you want to know what higher ed looked like in the 1400s? Walking through a class today. I mean, we got professors who just seem to be writing on slate, right? And the world's changed, and it doesn't matter how much logically they know we need to change. It causes extreme ripples when we're suddenly teaching online, hybrid, all kind of the things that are going on, and don't be frustrated with them because they hate it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is the natural thing for them to do. So I think the number one thing is don't be angry with your employees because they're fighting change. That's what they do. That's what we all do.
Mm-hmm.
Second, though, however, is you have to do 2 or 3 things for them to best adapt to change. One is educate them.
Okay.
There are some that just don't know. I mean, I really believe there are professors that work for me who don't recognize, as much as we've tried to tell them, They still don't recognize that it's different. So there's an education point of it.
Sure.
But it can't end there. Next is you then try to build opportunities for them to grow through it. In other words, put them in environments where they can slowly kind of step by step move to the new world. So Murray Bowen says there's about 2 ways you can really change a system. I think there's 3, but 2 is you can blow it up. I mean, you can strap bombs on yourself, walk in the house and blow the house up, and that'll change the system. And there are those who promote that right now, both in higher ed and our society. We should blow everything up and start over. The problem with blowing things up, John, is you kill a lot of people, and you got to decide, do you want to do that? The other is to nudge it along. Nudge it, let it restabilize. Nudge it, let it restabilize, and nudge it. The third would be to have such a strong leader that everybody respects that leader. They'll follow them into the darkness, whether they know where they're going or not. And that's about the 3 things people can do. So it's a long answer for a short question.
Yeah.
But the fact remains, what you can't do is say, hey, it's different. Y'all get on the stick. It'll be okay. People don't respond well to that.
Yeah.
So we go back to, first of all, strong leader that people trust is important. Second is have a managed kind of moment where you move them along, let them rest, move it along, let them rest. And over a period of moves, you get them to the next place. But understand they're very, very unstable during that process, and there's going to be a lot of conflict. But you've got to keep in mind where you're heading. You keep telling them that, and you just, one step at a time, move them to the new structure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The people hate change, but they love the idea of innovation.
Right.
And it's really the same thing.
It is.
There is a lot of similarities in terms of when you're talking about innovation versus when you're talking about change. And one of the things that is interesting about innovators is they tend to be pretty results-oriented. They tend to be pretty end-user-oriented.
Right.
And as a result of that, they're more willing to disrupt the system in order to deliver the result or the value that they're trying to achieve. And in the context of that, that creates a lot of conflict.
Right.
But it's fascinating how innovators, they have a confidence in terms of being able to work through it that allows them to move. Where a lot of organizations, they are fearful to move because of the uncertainties of the conflict that'll get created. So talk a little bit about why innovators seem to be successful and others get stuck.
So Edward Freeman, who's an expert on organizational conflict, basically talks about what he calls the gentle disruptors.
Yeah.
And I think what you're describing, innovators know how to, I call it gentle disruption. In other words, the good innovators don't walk in and purposely just blow people up, But what they do is they combine 2 things. They combine, number one, being someone people trust.
Yeah.
We will follow this person into the fire because we believe they know what they're doing. Great innovators still communicate that. And 2 is they move resolutely toward innovation.
Yeah.
And they invite people to take those steps along. If you can't take those steps, then okay, then you got blown up. But that's okay. I mean, I'm not trying to hurt you, right?
Yeah.
So they're still doing that kind of that disruption.
Yeah.
But they're doing it in a resolute, gentle, trustworthy kind of way. People believe them. So the great innovators you and I both know, people believe them when they say something, and they follow them even if they don't understand it.
Yeah.
And then they get pushed, and you know as well as I do, there's some fallout with that. Some people can't manage. And so I think the innovator says, I care about you. They're differentiating enough. I care about you as a person, but I don't care too much. I'm not going to take the company down. I'm not letting the vision go because of you. I'm resolutely moving you along. I want you to come with me.
Yeah.
If you can't hang, okay, I get that, right?
Yeah.
So that's that I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's kind of what I tend to see with the great leaders.
And from an industry standpoint, they also go outside the system.
Sure.
To where they're like, we're not going to change the system. And so we'll go outside the system. And this is what you're seeing in a lot of higher education institutions, where you have the innovators within that say, it's not going to happen within the system that we've created. And so they literally create another system that they can go build this program or this delivery module or whatever it is out here, and then without creating a ton of conflict, allow this system to experience
it will experience its own demise,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you and I have seen that, and I think it's fascinating because what they've done, and you and I've experienced this, where you look at an insular university that has to be different.
Yeah.
And over a period of years, a leader says, well, I could sit there and beg that entity to be different, or I can just move toward this other thing and invite you to come along, but we're moving toward this other thing. And so they create new systems. One thing that's really fascinating out of that work is don't ask a maintainer to be an innovator.
Sure.
Right? And
sure.
those are all interesting qualities that are necessary in organizations. But I think one of the mistakes that at least in my limited experience have seen is we'll go to somebody whose entire career has been that of a maintenance, production, administrative focused person, say, you need to be creative and you need to figure out how to do this differently. All you're doing is creating this incredible undue stress on them.
It's not how they're built.
And so why make them be something they're not? If there's a place for their maintenance, and there usually is within organizations, allow them to flourish, but protect your innovators. So a lot of companies, they have their own little project group. They're nothing but innovators. And they aren't saddled with a lot of administrative responsibility. They're out there scanning the horizon, trying to be innovative, and they aren't better than other people. That's their skill set. And I think where I see it go, I'm thinking of a nonprofit, a large nonprofit I've been working with recently. And the long story short is they tried to merge two big nonprofits that needed to be innovative, but then they put a person in charge who was a maintainer.
Yeah.
And so of all the effort they went to, it never got different. In fact, it began to shrink because they were asking somebody to do something that wasn't their skill set. And then when I got involved, I'm like, wrong person, wrong job.
Yeah.
And so that's really important. I think that going outside, finding innovators, not trying to force innovation on people who that's not their bailiwick.
Yeah, that's really, really important. And so getting outside of the context of conflict for just a second, as you're advising and working with leaders that are looking at the landscape, what are some of the things that leaders are identifying that they recognize as a threat or a potential failure if change doesn't come? What are some of the things that you talk about foresight? You talk about the innovators that are looking out there, looking at the landscape. What are those things that they're seeing where they go, we probably need to think about how we're positioned against that?
Right.
Tell us about that process.
I'm trying to think across industries, right? I'm not trying, because every industry has specific things.
Sure.
I'm trying to think about stuff that's more cross industry. One of that is resources. So money and I have a son in private equity. He's talking about, I don't care what the world looks like, private equity money's drying up. And so the idea of, so if you're in a nonprofit, hey, one thing we know is the money from foundations is drying up. We know in higher ed that cash cow that we call the traditional student. So there's a scarcity of resources, of traditional resources, a whole other way to do it. But traditional way we got resources is changing, right? Second is culture around us. What people expect out of industry, what people want out of their jobs, what they're willing to give. So tremendous frustration among traditional Gen X baby boom bosses and the amount of what they think the effort that they're getting from millennial Gen Z employees. We've all seen that, right? There's a different expectation of work. And so they're looking at my employee base is changing. And then the third being, I think, expectations of what industry does for society. There's an expectation that we're not just, the idea just, I'm going to make money for the sake of making money, but there's an expectation that we also do good in the process. I think I've seen those three things. So resources, the type of employee run into, and the expectation of production for society seem to be things that are cutting across the culture.
Yeah, and a couple more to add to that I think are important is to look out and say, okay, where do you see cost escalating like
Yeah.
crazy?
Oh, absolutely.
And when you see that, you're like, okay, that's ripe for disruption. Where do you see an industry or a company to where because of technological changes, because of consumer behavior,
Right.
where do you see the demand starting to change as it relates to that as well? And then, where do you see organizations that frankly are just they're not run efficiently?
Yep.
And those are the organizations I think where if you're looking out at that, you're going, we are ripe for disruption, and either we're going to change or change is going to come.
I was on a phone call this morning with a guy in private equity, and they are basically that here. This is fascinating. I probably let out some industry secret where I'm going to get sued over or something. But basically, the idea is this: they were looking at the financial industry, saying, mortgages and loans and credit cards. These long-term institutions are too slow in managing, and they're building a whole separate industry that has no physical space, that has and it's all technologically driven. And you see people touching on that, and there's a great example of the cost of the way we used to do business is untenable.
Yeah.
And then technology and convenience are driving it. And these guys are just, they tried working with existing banks. Or forget it. You guys just do that and have your tellers and do whatever you want to do. And they're building a whole different finance system to challenge. And it's based on those things you're talking about.
Yeah.
Technology, convenience, escalating costs.
Yeah.
He said, we can provide life insurance a whole lot cheaper than those people because we have no cost attached.
Sure.
It's fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. It's a changing world. And for many, it's really exciting because it creates opportunity.
And it's
for
threatening.
others,
It's threatening. Yeah.
For others, it's really scary because what's been sure and what's been known and what's been solid and stable no longer is that. So,
in my experience, I'm 62, and I remember grad school. And my memory of grad school was the old professor walking in, the old lion who stood up and lectured, and you're scared to death of him, and you gained what you could. And now I think about what it's like as a dean of university and trying to figure out how to connect with grad students 40 years later. And it's a whole different animal. It's about convenience. It's about service. It's about giving them something they can use. I would have been scared to death to tell my professor that I thought his lecture was irrelevant. I mean, but they don't mind now telling me, what's this got to do with the price of tea in China? I need a job. It's a different world, and I think it's true across industry.
Yeah, yeah. So talk a little bit about organizations that have been through conflict or been through failure. Give some practical advice in terms of how an organization can turn that challenge or that difficult moment or that embarrassment, perhaps even, how they can turn that into a learning moment, capture the learning from it, and make that a productive thing going forward.
Oh, yeah. The companies I've seen be really good at that, first of all, just owned it. They owned their failure publicly.
Mm-hmm.
And they owned it from the top on down. Even if it wasn't the CEO's fault, the CEO owned it. You know what? And they would gather their leader. Maybe they had all hands at a small company, but they gather leaders together and they get up and say, you know what? We did this and it didn't work. And I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't want to happen is to keep repeating that mistake.
Sure.
And so that ownership of it, and then to cast a vision of, you're going to help us solve it. Now, that's the interesting one I've noticed. Rather than the really good companies, rather than them pulling their little, the CEO and his three best leaders get together and they come up with a new answer, they tended to gather company-wide leaders together and said, and reframed it. This a failure is always opportunity to fall forward, right? So here's what happened. Now let's work on what it takes to move to a different place. And they gathered as many people together as needed to be in the room. And that's a little bit of a gift there, knowing who all to pull in. But letting them dream about moving forward. Second is being willing to spend the time and resources.
Sure.
So I run into a little bit of, I want to fix this, but I don't want to spend any time messing with it, and I don't want to spend any money messing with it. And restructuring can be time intensive and expensive. So if they own it, pull their leadership together and pour resources behind visioning, and then be willing to go outside and look at other industries. Some of the most innovative people I noticed, John, look to other industries
Yeah.
to learn from them. So it made no sense. I'd go back to higher ed because what I know the best. Make no sense for one university to go look at another university, even if they're being successful. It may be they go look at somebody in private equity, or they look at somebody in a different field and try to figure out what crosses back over.
Sure.
So, case study other industries, those kinds of things. CEO own it, pull it together, resources, cross-industry involvement seems to be kind of the stuff we're seeing.
And out of it, there will be something of value,
Right.
Even though it's painful. There will be something of value that you can use going forward. And if nothing else, you'll know not to do that again.
I really get suspect that people tell me they haven't failed. I'm like, yeah, you define life differently, haven't you? Because you look at the greatest companies in the country, and they fail multiple times.
Yeah.
And,
Well, we put Steve Jobs up there,
Oh, my
and
goodness.
rightfully so, but people forget that, he got crushed by Bill Gates for over a decade.
He did.
Into the personal computing business.
and we forget he got kicked out of his own company for 10 years. I mean, so he became CEO, and then I don't know what computer it was. He had some computer like Alicia or something that went south on him. And next thing you know, he's not even CEO anymore, and he's out in the desert, and then they bring him back. I mean, people don't think about how far south he went before he came back.
Yeah, and those are just the amazing stories that I say, success is just not A to Z.
Oh, no.
There's a lot of different moments along the way that are challenging moments, but are the critical moments that you learn what you need to learn to ultimately succeed.
Well, I heard recently a very successful person who said, the number one thing that I would try to drive into a young leader is persistence.
Mm-hmm.
That just persistence in failure and moving forward and always learning and seeing everything as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
He said persistence in failure creates the best success. And, he said the biggest problem, I think, is people quit too soon. That's what he said. People just quit too soon.
Yeah. So we're about out of time. Last question here, as again, we think about leaders that are dealing with organizations that are having to change.
Mm-hmm.
As we think about young people that are watching them and young people that are making decisions, you just referenced it, which was what prompted my thinking. What is it that leaders should model for young people in terms of managing all of the conflict that comes from the change that's going on in the world, the diversity that exists in the workplace, the intergenerational diversity that exists, and the differences there in terms of how people view work and each other. Talk a little bit about how is it that leaders, in having to manage all of that, can be good models for the next generation so that they're ready for their challenges and their moments of failure?
There's so much in that question. We talked about before. I will say we need to model for younger employees, number one, persistence and work ethic, which I think a lot of leaders do. You keep moving no matter how difficult it seems. You keep pushing forward, because I honestly believe the persistent leader finds ways.
Yeah.
I think we have to model patience. That real success doesn't happen overnight, and boy, I see that among the I met with a group of very young employees, and the amount of anxiety, I was like, you guys, you guys sure are anxious about everything. And finally, one of them said, in my head, I want to be wealthy by 35. I want to retire at 40. I'm like, yeah, you need to get over that. Life doesn't really work that way. And that idea that somehow I'm going to hit a home run every time and I'm going to do these great things. And it could be it takes you from the time you're 20 to 50 to kind of get that in place. And then you see the great things. So that patience, having a long-term vision is really not what's in our culture right now.
Yeah.
I think in terms of societally, somehow being gracious toward people, because there's a lot of stuff going on in society, being gracious toward people not like you, and yet not letting everything going on around us keep us from our goal. It'd be easy to chase. It becomes very easy for young employees to let social media drive your decisions.
Yeah.
But just drive forward to that one. And so I think in terms of persistence, patience, moving toward a goal, and then build a learning environment where every loss is a win, every loss is an opportunity to learn, and teach them that, that when things go south, instead of getting down, use that moment to say, what can I take from this that informs my next decision? I think those are the things that just become huge. The gap, you're talking about the gaps in work. It's the perception of older employees that there's a lack of work ethic in younger employees. Younger employees' perception is they don't want to change and they don't want to be different. The gap of expectation about how quickly rewards come. Those kinds of things, I think we manage that through these three things: persistence, patience, education, and connection. Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, those are great four things. And the workplace is complex today.
It is.
And it's going to be full of conflict, but there are some tools that leaders can use that you've shared here today that can be valuable in terms of helping leaders deal with those moments so they stay moments of conflict and don't become moments of failure. So Dr. Steve Joiner, thank you so much for being a part of the Fail It Forward podcast. Thanks for your time this morning. It's been a fun conversation. And I look forward to continue to working with you and continuing to chase all these opportunities to try to bring peace in the world.